Okay, so let's begin the session. So I'm assuming that you people have some background in economics. I mean to say Indian economy. Uh, yes, I mean I assume that you have a fair understanding of what Indian economy is. The basic terms like what is GDP, what is growth rate, isn't it? Good. So so what I'm going to do is, I think you might be already aware of the fact we're going to have two sessions, one today and tomorrow. And rather than discussing separately as economic survey and then the budget, so most probably we'll be covering the budget, the highlights and the importance of the budget today. And tomorrow I'll just give you a brief overview of economic survey. But before beginning of the session, let me make it clear about the fundamental difference between economic survey and budget. Because if you notice, the economic survey has been submitted by the finance minister the day before the budget. So what do you really think is the economic survey consist of? What does the economic survey consist of? And okay, if you are interested, you could interact with me and you could unmute. I do really think I don't need to. Okay, so if you are interested, you could interact. So yes, what do you really think is the economic survey consist of? What does the economic survey consist of? And what does the budget consist of? Yes, anyone? TK. So let me proceed. So the economic survey basically consists of, I think still people are joining. Okay, so TK, the economic survey fundamentally consists of the state of economy. So how Indian economy happens to perform in the current financial year. So if you look at the budget that's submitted on the first working day of February, generally that's a practice in India. In good old days, I mean, when I say before the current Modi government, the budget used to be submitted on the last working day of February. But right now, the budget is being submitted on the first working day of February. It's not 1st of February, it's the first working day of Parliament of February. So if you notice, the budget that is being submitted is for the coming financial year, that is for 25-26. So the year that's going to start with 1st April and ends on 31st March of 26. So if you notice budget, you don't find a term called budget in the entire constitution. Maybe you might have a good understanding of polity, Indian constitution, Indian polity, right? So if you just go through the entire constitution of India, you don't find a term called budget. Then why do people submit budget and what's basically the budget is all about? In fact, the most interesting that every Indian is really curious and worried about every year is the budget, because budget is really going to have a great impact not only on the common man, in fact the entire economic agents. So it could be government, it could be financial institutions, it could be corporates, name any economic agent. When I say economic agent, I refer to anything, an entity, an individual like you and me, who either would be able to influence economy or who would be influenced by the economy, and that's what I'm referring as an economic agent. So trade, financial institutions, financial markets, the government, the public sector undertakings, the private sector, I mean the corporates. So name any economic agent for that matter. The budget is going to have an impact on each and every economic agent. So when you don't find a word called budget, then why should the finance minister has to submit budget every year? In fact, if you could recollect, there's an article 112 which refers to annual financial statement. In fact, it is this annual financial statement the finance ministers which the bound to submit every financial year is what in general we do use it. We do refer it as a budget. In fact, the word budget is from a French word called budget, which does mean a leather bag. So what I'm going to do is, in common parlance, people use a word called budget, but ideally you could refer it as an annual financial statement, and I would suggest that was the most appropriate term to refer the so-called budget. But what does an annual financial statement consist of? And why should the finance minister has to submit this annual financial statement to the parliament? So if you look at the definition of annual financial statement, it's a comprehensive statement. It's a comprehensive financial statement that records all possible receipts of the government of India. When I say receipts, what do you really think is the receipt of government of India? What basically consists of receipts? What does it mean? Yes? Is there anyone who would like to answer? An annual financial statement is a comprehensive statement of all possible receipts of government of India and the statement of expenditure of government of India. So when I say receipts, it does mean the any amount of money, either in the form of income or in the form of borrowings, that gets credited into consolidated fund of India. And I assume that you are already aware of the fact about the three different accounts of government of India: the consolidated account, consolidated fund, contingency fund, and public account of India. So we don't have much time to discuss about the difference between these things, because I assume that you would be already having a basic information on these fundamentals. But don't worry, in case if you have any problem, okay, we find some time to brief up and review all these things. But as of now, I'm here to give you a overview of the current budget, so that the students who are appearing for this preliminary examination, it would be comfortable and they would be updated. So if you look at the receipts of the government of India, I said it basically consists of all possible income, sources of income, and all possible liabilities or borrowings of government of India. So whatever the money that gets credited into consolidated fund of India, the inflow is what I'm referring as receipts. So do keep that in mind. The word receipt doesn't mean only income of government of India. It includes both income and borrowings. Am I clear? And since the money the government of India mobilizes is from the public. In fact, if I ask you a simple question, what do you really think is the largest source of income to government? Yes? Is there anyone? What's the large source of income? What's the largest source of income to the government? What's the major
Tax
source of income to
revenue,
government? Yes?
Taxes.
taxes.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so in fact, okay, so I want some of you to interact. The reason is, okay, I don't want it to be a monologue. Okay? Yes, so that I will be able to figure out to what extent you're able to catch up what I've been discussing. Okay? Yes, very good. Okay, so Navneeta, yeah. So the major source of income to the government is taxation. Tax revenue. Either it could be direct tax revenue or it could be indirect tax revenue. But the major chunk or the major source of income to the state is the tax revenue. Then someone happens to point out borrowings. In fact, borrowings, of course, Indian government do borrow a good sum of money. But at the end of the day, if you just look at the major chunk happens to be in the form of taxes. And when you say taxes, it could be a corporate tax. The tax that corporates pay, personal income tax, or GST, the tax on our expenditures. Name any form of tax. Don't you really think all this tax is a burden on the common man? Burden on the people. And don't you really think the tax that we are liable to pay to the state is nothing but part of our income that we are paying back to the state? Am I clear? Isn't it? Yes. So the reason why the finance minister has to submit the budget to the parliament, that's what I've been discussing. The reason is every penny the government borrows or the government rises from the public is the public money that belongs to public. Every penny the government borrows is a liability on the public. You see what I said? The borrowings of government of India or the debt of government of India is what we call as a public debt. In fact, the more appropriate term for the so-called fiscal policy, you heard about it, I guess, it's public finance. So every penny the government mobilizes is a penny that belongs to the people. Every penny the government borrows is a liability on the public. And that being the reason, without a prior consent of the public, I mean the citizens of India, the government has no right to collect a single penny. And since all this money the government mobilizes from us, either in the form of taxes or in the form of borrowings, is the money that belongs to the public. That being the reason, the state should have the consent of public before spending the same money back to the public. And that explains the reason why the finance minister has to submit the annual financial statement before the commencement of every financial year to the parliament. I hope you understand, Amala. And at the same time, you also might have noticed the fact the budget is submitted in both the houses of the parliament, yes, Lok Sabha and also Rajya Sabha. And the discussion on the budget, the debate on the budget would take place in both the houses. But you might also be aware of the fact, when it comes to voting on the budget, the right to vote on budget is only with the members of Lok Sabha. Can someone give me an answer? Because I have explained the reason why the finance minister has to submit budget to the parliament. But my question to you is, when the budget is submitted in both the houses of parliament and discussed, debated in both the houses of parliament, why only the privilege to vote on the budget is only left to Lok Sabha members? Why not Rajya Sabha members? Aparna, Tameen, anyone? Yes. Why is that? Very good.
They are directly elected people.
Very good. Fantastic. In fact, the members of Lok Sabha are the direct representatives of people. That's it. So if you look at the answer for my first question, that is why should the finance minister has to submit budget to the parliament? Because har ek penny the government happens to mobilize is the money that belongs to the people. And every penny the government is spending is the money that belongs to the people. And that's a very basic reason without their consent. But don't you think it's going to be a very difficult task? Isn't it putting the budget to voting and ask every Indian to vote on the budget? You see what they're saying? The government, rather than asking each and every individual, is simply asking the consent of the representatives of people. That's it. That's a simple logic. Now, since the very basic essence of this discussion is to understand about the current or this year budget, and tomorrow we're going to have a brief discussion on the economic survey. I'm just going to cover only the highlights of economic survey because it's a very lengthy document and you really don't need to worry about everything on every component of economic survey unless you have in your mind to prepare for economics option. So for general studies, especially for your preliminary examination, a brief overview of economic survey is good enough. But what I'm going to do is to make things simple and to have a better understanding and so that you could grasp better. Before beginning of the session, I want you to have a overview of the current state of Indian economy. Because when I say budget, it's basically the annual plan for the next coming financial year. So the finance minister is simply telling the people of this country, my dear people of my country, this is how in the next coming year, I'm planning to mobilize money. So if you notice the total expenditure, the total budget outlay for this year is around 50 lakh crore rupees of money. So she happens to draw a plan to spend roughly around 50 lakh crore rupees of money. But how is she mobilizing this money? And this 50 lakh crore rupees of money that she is planning to spend in the next coming financial year, what part of it is in the form of direct taxes? And within the direct taxes, what part of it is in the form of income tax? What part of it is in the form of corporate tax? And how much out of it is in indirect tax? How much is customs duty? How much is the GST? And if the income of the government is less than its planned expenditure, then obviously, what do you think the government has to do? Aparna? Navneeta? If your income is less than your planned expenditure, generally that's where we got, okay, you people use the term called deficit. What do you mean by deficit? shortage. Am I right, beta? Isn't it? So when we use the word surplus, it does mean excess. And when it comes to deficit, it does mean shortage. But in case if you have a shortfall of income, I mean, if your income is less than your planned expenditure, do tell me, beta, Mala, what would you generally do? Imagine your personal expenses itself. So you had a plan to spend some 10 lakh rupees next financial year, but you figured out your income is less than your planned expenditure. Beta, what do you generally think you will gonna do in case you experience a shortfall? Very good, simple. You borrow. People don't steal money, right? In fact, it's illegal, and it doesn't make sense begging, and it's unethical, right? So the only option we're left with borrowings. So every penny the government borrows is a liability on the public, right? So that's a very basic reason when you look at a budget. So most of you would really think this so-called lengthy speech and various programs of government of India is what people consider as budget. But budget is simply a financial statement that records all possible receipts and all the expenses of the government of India for the next coming financial year. So in fact, I would say the budget is simply planned for the next financial year. But when you are formulating a plan for the next year, don't you really think people do have a plan, not for 1 year or 2 years, isn't it? In general, for a state like India, people do have a plan for a very long run, isn't it? Am I clear? So I think most of you might also have a plan for your career, isn't it? So what are you going to be in the next 20 years? What are you going to be in the next 25 years? How are you going to retire? If you crack this exam and become an IAS officer, how are you going to retire? So same thing holds good even for government. Even state do has a very long-term plan. 15 years down the line, what should India has to achieve? 20 years down the line, where should India has to be? We're already fifth largest economy in terms of nominal GDP and third largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity. And do you really think India is happy with it? No. Every nation would like to, isn't it, increase its output, produce more goods and services, so that more production of goods and services would result in more employment opportunities. More employment opportunities would result in more income generation. More income generation would result in more spending capacity of people. And more spending capacity of people would result in more demand. And rising demand would result in incentivizing producers to produce more goods. Am I right? So that's how the economy would experience a virtuous cycle. More output, more income, more employment, more income, more spending. Am I right? And then that would incentivize producers to produce more goods and services. So इसका मतलब है every nation would prefer reporting a very decent economic growth. Year on year, it wanna ensure the output keeps on increasing. So like you people have a very long-term plan for your career. So even the government and even the nation India do has a very long-term plan. And how many of you heard about a term called Vikshit Bharat? Vikshit Bharat. Anyone in the class, have you heard about a term called Vikshit Bharat? Yes? Come on. So what do you mean by it, Vikshit Bharat? What does it mean? What does Vikshit Bharat mean? What does Vikshit Bharat mean? Yeah, of course. I'm not asking you by which year we're gonna, okay, isn't it? So I'm asking you what's the meaning of the term called, I mean, Vikshit Bharat ka matlab kya hai? Vikshit Bharat.
Developed nation.
Pardon?
Developed nation. To bring India as a developed nation.
Okay. What else? Development. So, I mean, is my screen visible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you now just look at it, okay. So basically, when in the name of Vikshit Bharat, someone has pointed out, and I think you all heard about a term called Amrit Kal. Amrit Kal. Yes. Have you heard about a term called Amrit Kal? Or how many of you been aware of the fact we have celebrated something called Amrit Mahotsav? Never heard about it? Come on, beta. Amrit Mahotsav. Yes. Yeah. So what does it mean? So the Amrit Mahotsav is Okay, in 2022, the 75th year of independence is what we happen to celebrate in the name of Amrit Mahotsav. And the government is calling this next 25 years from this 75th to the 2047 is what the government is referring as Amritka. And now the Prime Minister of India, around 1 year back, happens to calling his chief ministers and happen to put forth a vision, a long-term plan for the country. And what does this man would like to achieve? By 2047, our Prime Minister want to see India would be attaining a developed country status. So he want to ensure that this country would be recognized as a developed country. I think most of you might be aware of the fact, as of now, India is referred as an emerging market developing economy. Emerging market developing economy. In short form, people refer it as a EMDE, emerging market developing economy. And in terms of per capita income, we are referred as lower middle income country. Lower middle income country. Low income countries, middle income countries, high income countries, and within middle income, we are a lower middle income country with a per capita income of roughly around $2,500. But this man want to ensure that the per capita income of Indians by 2047 would shoot up to $10,000 minimum. So that means he has a plan, a dream to quadruple or per capita income, $2,500 to $10,000. And do you really think that is something can be achieved only by the efforts of the union government? No, right? So the state has to, isn't it, put forth their efforts. Isn't it? So this is basically a dream that we people collectively could realize. Am I clear now? So that's how this man by 2047 has set some major goals. And henceforth, everything that we do from now, every year, every month, every day, the state intends to perform is to realize the objectives in the long run. That is by 2047. What does Mr. Modi want to achieve? He just want to ensure that absolutely there will be zero poverty in this country. Zero poverty in this country. The second, 100% good quality school education. Because many a times you might have heard about the very common term that the Prime Minister of India keeps using. That is demographic dividend. Can someone explain the meaning of the whole demographic dividend?
Working age class of youth working age.
Youth working, okay. Demographic dividend, beta. Okay. So demography. What do you mean by demography? Demography. It's simply a study of population. Dividend. How do you define a term called dividend? Dividend is simply the returns on the investment. That's the simplest way. I'm oversimplifying it since we don't have enough time. So dividend is basically, if let's suppose you made some investment and you own some asset, and don't you really think assets has a potential to generate some income? And that returns upon your assets or your investments is what we call dividend. You buy a share and the company, if it makes profits, is going to share with the shareholders, and that's what you could call a dividend. The Prime Minister, whenever he's abroad, he commonly uses this term called demographic dividend. The reason India, as of now, is considered as one of the world's youngest country. When I say youngest country, not in terms of civilization, because this is the country that has a very large young population. Do you know the median age of Indian population is 28 years? Whereas the second largest populated country, China, its median age is 38 years. And for the developed countries, it's much more. And I guess most of you heard about the problem that majority of the developed countries are experiencing, especially the severe problem that Japan is experiencing, the problem of aging. The problem of aging. I mean, the percentage of productive age group in comparison to the dependent age group is reducing. But if you notice, India the median age is 28 years. So this man is expecting that sooner or later my country would become the factory of labor. In fact, most of you might be aware of the fact that India happens to attract a very good amount of foreign direct investment. Maybe you are aware of the fact Google, its second largest office is right now being built in Hyderabad. And recently the same Google has opened a very big office in Bangalore. BMW, isn't it? German automobile, one of the finest automobile maker, and no matter wherever they produce their automobile, but the software that gets embedded into this automobile is written in Bangalore city. The reason, as of now, India has a decent quality of human capital. When I say human capital, I'm referring to the knowledge and skill set of the individuals. But at the same time, most of you might also be aware of the fact a good number of Indians doesn't have a proper access to education and better health amenities. Don't you really think having a very large population is not good enough? Isn't it? And a very large young population itself is not good enough. They should be fit for work. They should be qualified enough to perform a certain economic activity. And for that, it's not simply population matters. You need to have a good quality of human capital. People with better knowledge and better skill set. You guys accept it? So that being the reason, this man also want to ensure, because I think you heard about something called, in fact, that too from Kerala, okay, it's 100% literacy, isn't it? If you look at Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, isn't it? The state of Kerala has already attained literacy rate of 100% quite long back. But do you really think the literacy rate is 100% across all parts of India? Do you think every state has realized this? No, there's still states that are struggling. Got it? So if people cannot afford to read or write, at least in their mother tongue, what's the point of having a very large young population? So that being the reason, the second major focus by 2047 is to ensure 100% good quality school education. The third and the most important is access to high quality, affordable and comprehensive healthcare. Because most of you guys might be aware of the fact, Hamara Desh mein, around 80, in fact, more than 80% of expenses on health is upon the individual expenses. I mean, it comes from our own pockets. Because the investment by the state on public health infrastructure is very low. You'll be surprised to know, since independence to this point of time, never ever, no government for that matter, has spent not more than 2% of GDP on education or health. You guys getting it? So that being the reason, the other most important objective or a goal he would like to realize is access to high quality, affordable and comprehensive healthcare. And then 100% skilled labor with meaningful employment. 70% women in economic activities. So I think 100% skilled labor with meaningful employment doesn't require an explanation. But let me explain what's the 70% women in economic activities. Okay, just now I happen to refer the fact that 28 years is the median age of Indian population. But we are discussing in the context of 70% women in economic activities. What does it mean? So he want to ensure that the labor force participation rate of women in India would go up to 70%. But before that, let me ask, is there anyone in the class who could define me the term labor force? See, my friends, okay, I never seen your face. And at the same time, since you're all learning, and believe in me, you have a fundamental right to make mistakes. And that's how we learn. Please don't feel shy in making mistakes. So how would you define a term called labor force? Yes, can someone, okay, unmute and give me an answer? Out of pocket. So I didn't get it, Shireen. What do you mean out of pocket? Labor force. I'm asking you the meaning of a term called labor force. Because, okay, here on the screen, you have something called 70% women in economic activities. That's what Mr. Modi wanna ensure. I mean, labor force participation rate of women, which is right now hardly around 32%. And he wanna ensure it would go up to 70%. Yes, very good. Working. So you mean to say working? Okay. Okay. Yeah, very good. Okay, at least you people happens to have put forward some effort. Very good. I appreciate. So let me make it clear. Generally, they practice, my friends. People within the working age group. That has been, when I say working age group, that is 15 to 64 years. Out of total population, those people who fall within the age group of 15 to 64 years is what we call as working age population or a productive age group of a country. This is a standard definition. So what do you mean by productive age group or working age group? The one who falls within 15 to 64. And the rest of the population, that's been less than 15, more than 64, we call them as dependent. And that's the reason just now I referred. Look at Japan, the proportion of dependents is increasing in comparison to the productive age group. You see what I said? They are experiencing the problem of aging. Since they are experiencing severe shortfall of labor force. Labor. That's the reason Japanese economy has stagnated for more than 2 decades. But whereas India has a very huge young population. But within this working age group, so I hope now you understand what is a working age group or productive age group. Within this working age group, those people who are willing to work or who are looking for an opportunity to work or who are already working is what is referred as labor force. I hope you understand the difference. So not everyone who falls within the age group 15 to 64 is considered as labor force. Either you should be right now working or willing to or looking for an opportunity. Then you are considered as a labor force. Let's say someone in the class is still in college pursuing their BA or some BTech engineering. So you're still in college. You're not ready and you're not desperate looking for a job. You might be above 50, but as of now, you're pursuing some, isn't it? You're just okay. You're going to college and you're just trying to acquire some skills. So you don't be considered as part of labor force because as of now, you're not ready and you're not looking for a job opportunity desperate. So hence, you would not be ideally considered as a labor force. And I hope you understand. And when it's a labor force participation rate, does mean the labor force divided by the total working age population or productive age group. So what part of productive age group are either working or looking for an opportunity to work is basically given by labor force participation rate. But if you look at as of now, the labor force participation rate of women in India is hardly 32%. Now look at our prime minister is great. Okay, in fact, he's very proud that India is going to be the factory of labor. We are going to be the very youngest country with a very large base of young population. But don't you really think of a good part? In part, because the reason is women hardly correspond, roughly constitute 50% of Indian population. And if these people are not willing to participate, then do you really think India would be able to realize and reap the dividend out of this large young population? No. Am I right? So that's the basic reason. The other major goal this man has is to ensure 70% women in economic activities. And the last one and the most important is farmers making our country the food basket of the world. How many of you have been aware of the fact India is one of the world's largest producer of many food grains? So especially when it comes to paddy, we are one of the world's largest exporter of paddy. 330 million tons of food grains is what India has cultivated roughly in the last financial year. And we are expecting it would cross around 332 million tons this year. But at the same time, most of you might be aware of the fact, though we've been cultivating a very large amount of food grains, but 50% of our edible oil is met through imports. 50%, not 50% of our edible oils is met through imports. And not only edible oils, in fact, pulses. India is one of the world's largest cultivator of pulses, consumer of pulses, but we also import a very large amount of pulses. So if you notice, the current problem that India is experiencing is there is too much of certain basket of agriculture produce and there's too less of certain basket of agriculture produce. So when it comes to pulses, oil seeds, we have too less than what's required. When it comes to paddy, wheat, and other food grains, we have more than what we need. But there are certain reasons behind why we have such a skewed cultivation pattern. Why farmers prefer cultivation of some variety, and why are they simply neglecting, or the reason behind it. So we will not be discussing it. I guess you might be aware of the fact. Okay, so this is basically what the long-term vision of government of India. And whenever you read budget for that matter, not only this year, next year, you should always have this in mind. Every plan for the government and every year of government, the plan is to realize these basic objectives. But at the same time, though you have a long-term plan, but your plan as of now has to be in accordance with the current economic state. Am I right? So what's the current economic challenges? So henceforth, let's start with what's the current economic challenge India is experiencing? What's the state of Indian economy? And then we'll move ahead. And okay, so that gives you a better understanding of Indian economy. So if I ask you, what do you really think are the domestic and external challenges India right now is experiencing? Anyone in the class? What are the challenges that India is experiencing within domestic and external challenges? Anything, either a domestic challenge or external challenge. Come on, friends. What are the challenges right now India is experiencing? Yes, at least external challenges. How many of you are aware of the fact about the Russia-Ukraine war? Yes, disguised unemployment. Okay, very good, fantastic. Someone happens to. So, what do you mean by it, beta? Shireen, what do you mean by disguised unemployment?
Marginal utility zero.
Okay, marginal utility of what? Labor is zero.
Zero.
Yeah,
Yes.
marginal utility of labor is a zero. I mean, yeah, okay. Because many a times, okay, because India has a very huge labor supply, but we don't have enough demand for the labor. So hence, for what do people do? They end up employing more than what's required. So issue is just where two people could do the job, you end up employing four people, but at the end of the day, you end up spending the same time, same amount of money. So iska matlab hai, the contribution of the extra labor employed is literally zero. He hardly contributes anything. And that's the problem we are experiencing just because we are having surplus of labor, isn't it? And we don't have enough demand for labor. वो तो ठीक है, but इसके अलावा can you? Okay, let's start with external challenges. So, what are the external challenges you think India is experiencing right now?
Import.
Pardon, sir?
Import. We are just trying to more import.
Import more. Okay. What else? Trade deficit. Okay. What else?
Depreciation.
Depreciation of rupee. Very good. Fantastic. Now, yes. Okay. You people right now in the group. What else? Russia war, crude oil. Very good. Fantastic. Yes. So now let's look at it. Isn't it? So since 2022, okay, the war between Russia and Ukraine has resulted in a severe shortage of raw materials. Because I think you all may be aware of the fact Russia is one of the world's largest supplier of oil and also gas. In fact, for that matter, the entire Europe is dependent upon oil and gas supply from Russia. Since Russia is bestowed with huge amount of natural resources, and same is the case with Ukraine. Maybe you might not have much heard about Ukraine, but Ukraine is the football for the former USSR. You heard about the steppes, grasslands, prairies, pampas, temperate grasslands, right? So what Punjab, Haryana is to India is what Ukraine is for the former USSR. In fact, Ukraine is also one of the world's largest exporter of fine quality of wheat, along with Russia. So when these two nations are at loggerheads for more than 2 years, the world economy is experiencing a severe shortage of raw materials because Russia, Brazil are one of the world's largest exporters of commodities. Unlike China, these countries export mostly raw materials. And pura dunia is more or less depend upon the raw materials that are being imported from these nations. And because of this prolonged war, what happened for the last 2 years, most of the economies, including India, they're experiencing severe inflation, very high rate of inflation. Of course, India, it's around roughly it's around 5 to 6%. But if you notice, the inflation that's been experienced by Americans and Europeans in the last 2 years is the highest rate of inflation they experienced in the last 40 years. So one thing you should keep in mind, because right now we are living in the era of globalization. Am I clear, sir? Do you accept it better, Shirin? Anything that happens across the world would have a great impact on Indian state. Do you accept it? Do you accept the fact Russia-Ukraine conflict has an impact on Indian economy? Yes or no? Do you really think that Trump coming back to power has any impact on Indian economy? So Trump being the president of United States of America would obviously have an impact on United States of America. But will that have any impact on Indian economy? So what do you really think could be the impact of Trump being back to power? Very good. Fantastic. Someone happens to point out because since the day he came to power, and in fact, before coming to power itself, he was been saying that I am going to increase tariffs. I'm going to increase tariffs. And he openly ended up saying, any country that discourages use of dollar, I'm going to retaliate by imposing 100% tariffs. But why? Why do you really think, Shireen, that this man is simply has gone so crazy and simply saying, I'm going to impose very high tariffs? Is that he's a crazy guy? Why? And what do you really think he's going to realize by imposing such high tariffs? Right? He already has some up proposal of increasing tariffs in Canada, from Canada, okay, on Canada, isn't it? Right? Mexico, right? What do you mean by it? Why would he impose tariffs? What do you think at the end of? Because if the president of US itself is doing it, it has to have some purpose. You cannot end up saying, Sergi, he is crazy, right? There has to be some reason. Simple, very good. Someone has pointed. It's simply to boost the domestic economy of USA. But how come you imposing tariffs would boost American economy? Yes, Avantika, Amala, beta. How could imposing tariffs from abroad would have an impact on American economy? So how does it boost American economy? Come on, yes, friends. Because when you are imposing high tariffs on the goods that are imported from different parts of the world, so these imported products becomes costly, and that obviously incentivizes Americans to look after domestically produced goods, that is American produced goods. And by that logic, he just want to ensure there would be enough employment opportunities created within United States of America, and that would drive a better economic prosperity within United States of America. So his goal is simply to increase the size of GDP, ensure the American economy reports a decent growth rate. That's it. Like what our Modi is doing it, right? Since the time he came to power in 14, he been simply coining the same term, "Make in India." And now during COVID, we have coined one more thing, Atmanirbhar Bharat. Am I right, sir? What do you really think is basically, in fact, "Make in India" is a slogan. So what do you really think the meaning of the term "Make in India"? What does he mean by name "Make in India"? What is he trying to promote, or what is he trying to achieve? Make in India. And in this year budget and the economic survey, the government also said we are not only looking for make in India, we are also looking for make for India and make for the world. So what do you mean by make in India? What do you mean by make for India? What do you mean by make for the world?
Domestic production and commercialization.
Very good. So the simple. See, the thing is that, see, how many of you been aware of the fact India is the world's second largest consumer of electronics, the second largest consumer of electronics in the world. But you know, there is not a single IC fabricating unit in this country. I guess you understand the meaning of IC fabrication, right? Integrated chip fabrication. That being the reason you heard about something called recently initiative by government, production linked incentive, design linked incentive. The government itself is coming forward and said, "Arey, like, I am here to provide an incentive. So if you just meet a certain production target, whether it could be in textiles, pharmaceuticals, electronics, heavy machines, doesn't matter. Every sector I would incentivize. Casey, either by providing you some tax incentives, or giving back you the tax money collected from you, or giving you some capital subsidy. I'm here to incentivize. And all that I'm looking for is to increase the production within the country. That being the reason, you might be aware of the fact India used to be net importer of arms and ammunition, defense produce. But right now, India is also one of the world's largest exporter of defense equipment. We used to import toys. Now we have been a net exporter of toys. Right. So what this man is simply saying is that when India has such a great consumption capacity, you know, the total middle class population of India is more than the total population of African continent. More than the total population of African continent. And let me show you. And I guess you understand the meaning of the word called GDP, right, sir? Does everyone understand the term called GDP? Yes. What does GDP stand for? Gross domestic product. So in simple terms, it's simply the total economic activity or the total output, right? So the market value of all final goods and services produced within a financial year in the domestic territory of India. And the simplest way of computing GDP is by summing up or through expenditure method. And can someone give me the formula for GDP? Yes. Can someone give me the formula for GDP? Come on. Yes. Anyone? Simply, it is equal to, let me write here, Y is equal to PFCE. Kabhi suna PFCE? It does mean private final consumption expenditure. I mean consumption expenditure of the households. C, that's what, okay, maybe you might have heard about the formula GDP. That is Y equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Kabhi suna? Right? So rather than C plus I plus G plus X minus M, I'm just writing it in simply some standard format. So rather than C, we use a term called PFCE, which stands for private final consumption expenditure. It's simply consumption expenditure made on final consumer goods by all the non-government entities, and that is denoted by PFCE. And to that, we add GFCE, government final consumption expenditure, and whatever the consumption expenditure of the government. And then we add it, the gross capital formation, I mean investment. To that, we add the net exports, which is gap between exports and the imports. So that's the simplest formula. I hope you understood, right? So PFCE plus GFCE plus gross capital formation plus net exports minus imports. So if you have noticed it, my friends, here is basically the chart that gives you a bar chart that gives you what contributes what proportion to the GDP, how much each of these component contributes to GDP. Let's look at 24, the financial 24, or we'll just look at any of it. So if you look at PFCE, they go 61%, somewhere from 22 to 24. If you notice, around 60% of contribution to GDP is by the PFCE. That's been private final consumption expenditure. Has been consumption expenditure households do contributes more to GDP. That explains the reason, my friends, the reason why India soon after COVID, the year after COVID, during COVID, India, I mean the year of COVID, India has reported a negative growth of minus 5.7%. But you know that the year next to COVID, India has reported a growth rate of 9.7%. And such a phenomenal recovery is what no country across the world has experienced. So from a negative 5.7 to a positive 9.7, okay, in the very next year after COVID is what no country in the world has achieved. But that's what we proved. We bounced back in spite of such a great crisis, worst crisis that we have experienced in the entire, I mean, unfortunately, in the last 100 years, we still happens to bounce back to 9.2%, 9.7%. And you know the reason behind it, where does the basic strength comes from? Because India has a very great domestic consumption capacity. A significant part of a GDP is contributed by the private final consumption expenditure. And then the next major component, if you could notice, what's the next major contributor to the GDP? Look at it. What's the next major contributor to GDP? Yes. What's the next major contributor to GDP? Come on, make it fast. It's a gross capital formation. And what do you mean by gross capital formation? It simply means investment. And when you say investment, it could be investment made by private sector or it could be investment made by the government. So capital formation does mean the amount of money invested on capital assets. And what are capital assets? Basically, those assets that are used to produce other goods and services. In simple terms, we call it an investment. And the total expenditure on capital formation or investment is roughly around 31%. And then comes the government expenditure, then you have exports and imports. And if you could notice, almost whatever is the graph, okay, isn't it, bar chart we have, you would notice that every year we've been experiencing a negative net exports. That's mean we're always experiencing a trade deficit. Our exports are less than compared to imports. Am I right? Hi, Anna. Yes, friends. Yes. So now with this, now let's look at basically. So I hope now you understood the major contributor to Indian GDP is the domestic consumption. So that being the reason, though there's been the crisis in the world economy, and at the same time, you should look at major economies like United States of America, European nations. Have you heard about something called European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism? Have you seen CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism? In a way, the European nations are also discouraging imports to their countries, especially carbon-intensive products, by proposing to impose very high tariffs. So more or less, every developed country across the world, in order to boost their domestic activity, somehow is discouraging imports. Somehow discouraging imports. Why? At the end of the day, their intention is to boost their domestic activity. So iska matlab hai, being aware of the fact the world is looking for protecting their own protecting their own economies. Don't you really think, my friends, if you been the policymaker, it doesn't make sense relying or believing that the Indian economy would be driven by foreign consumption or through exports? Do you accept it, friends? Anjana, beta, isn't it? So that being the reason, I think most of you been aware of the fact. Right now, if you look at China, okay, have you heard anything about China in the recent past? And what was the interesting news that you heard about China in the recent past? Yes. How many of you heard about China and what is happening within China? Is there anyone? So these days you might be coming across various, I mean, different types of news like ghost cities increasing. Okay. No, it's not about the AI tool. Okay, TK chalta. Okay. So beyond that, I just want something beyond that. What else you heard about China? Other than China-US trade war? Well, very good. Okay, so other than the recently launched AI tool, I want you to, recollect investment. Okay, Edu Krishnan, what do you mean by investment? What does it mean? You know, my friends, China, let me make it clear. China, since 1979, almost for 3 decades, has reported consistently double-digit growth rate, a growth rate of more than 10%. And I guess you all understand the meaning of growth rate, the rate of change in output. So output increase in the country, China, was more than 10%, and it maintained a double-digit growth rate for consecutively 3 decades. But since 2016, the Chinese economy slowly started experiencing a contraction. And COVID has further resulted in a much severe contraction. And right now, the Russia-Ukraine war and the increasing rates of inflation and underperformance of these developed nations and slow growth rates within these developed nations and very less consumption within the developed countries has further hurt Chinese investments and Chinese output. Because unlike India, where dunia manufactures and dumps in India, we're a market for the world, more or less. Whereas if you look at China, it is a manufacturing hub of the world. It manufactures for the world. So China has a production capacity that is good enough to meet the global demand. But now, have you noticed? So what I'm just trying to convey, my friends, the fundamental difference between Indian economy and Chinese economy. Chinese economy is driven by global demand, mostly global demand, because they cater to the global markets. इसी वजह से ना, when there is a contraction in the global economy, or mostly the developed countries where it exports a large quantity of goods and services, the Chinese economy to experience a severe contraction. Whereas Indian economy is primarily driven by domestic consumption. Domestic consumption. So that's the fundamental difference. And that being the reason, in spite of the global economy experiencing a relative contraction, still India is able to report a decent economic growth. Now tell me, my dear friends, if you been the policymaker, do you really believe on relying global economic demand to boost Indian economy, or would you prefer promoting domestic consumption if you really want to achieve a better economic growth? Amala, what would you depend on? Domestic economy, domestic consumption, or would you depend on external consumption? Don't you think it makes sense for a country like India to depend on domestic consumption? Am I right? The more is the domestic consumption, the more is the output produced, and larger is the GDP. Am I clear now? Yes. But whereas if you look at China right now, if you notice, since there is a global contraction and every developed country is resorting to these so-called protectionist measures, resulting in a decreased imports from China. So China now has excessive production capacity, resulting in a massive unemployment. The most interesting thing, when the entire world is experiencing high rates of inflation, China, almost for the last 1-2 years, is experiencing a deflation. Do you understand the difference between inflation, deflation? Inflation का मतलब है rise in prices. Deflation, fall in prices. Why China experiences this phenomenon? Because they have more output. Because they have the ability to produce more output, and they are producing more output. Electric vehicles, computers, mobile phones, name anything. They are producing at a very large scale. But since the world economy is not having the appetite to consume all of it, and the domestic consumption capacity of China is also limited, now what happened? There too much of goods and services in the market, but too less consumption capacity among the domestic, okay, within the domestic market of China. So you see what I just said, the price of goods and services in China, on the contrary, is decreasing. Dunia is experiencing rising prices, whereas China is experiencing falling prices. The reason? Chinese economy is primarily driven by global economic demand or global growth. Whereas our strength lies in domestic consumption. And that itself explains the reason why this year the finance minister has come with okay, can someone point out? And here is a clue. So what does it mean? Come on. Anyone in the class?
Tax.
Huh? So what does it mean to? What do you mean by tax?
Savings.
Huh? So how many of you have been aware of the fact the finance minister has come with a proposal in the current budget where these people earning an annual income of up to 12 lakhs doesn't need to pay a single penny. In fact, इसका मतलब नहीं doesn't need to pay a single penny, but there is a tax rebate. Tax rebate. What do you mean by tax rebate? Okay, so someone has pointed out progressive tax. So if you look at, my dear friends, this is the current income tax, income tax slab rates. So what does it say? For people who earn income between 0 to 4 lakhs. I mean, if your annual income is up to 4 lakhs, your income is exempted from taxation. I mean, your income is completely non-taxable. That's what is the meaning of it, tax exempted. I mean, your income of 4 lakhs is not considered as a taxable income. And your income is from 4 to 8 lakhs. That means you want to pay 5% of your income. When I say 4 to, let's suppose, imagine Amala is earning 6 lakh rupees of income. Amala is earning 6 lakh rupees of income. As per this slab rate, how much is the tax, Amala, you are liable to pay? Yes? How much are you liable to pay? Anjana? Imagine you are earning 6 lakh rupees of income as per this slab rate that I happen to show you on the slide. How much tax you are liable to pay? Yes? Anyone? Come on, yaar, make a guess. We are running out of time. See, I could spend more time, not a big deal. But at the end of the day, what's the point of me just giving? Of course, I don't want you to give me the person because it's been clear. Okay. Better Fatima, it's clear on this. Okay, isn't it board? I want the tax money you're liable to pay, liability. 5% of, let's say,
30%.
I'm sorry, just give me a second. I'm saying, let's say Shweta Raj. Okay, she earns 6 lakh rupees of income. 6 lakh rupees is your income. In such case, you, Shweta, better you said 5%. Is that 5% of 6 lakhs?
30%.
30%. No, I'm just asking you a simple question. Agar if you earn an income of 6 lakhs, as per the slab rate that is on the board, how much is the tax you're liable to pay? That's my question. 30,000. Okay, so 5% of 6 lakh. Amala, is that how you compute it? Yeah, I guess, isn't it? So because that 30,000 is basically 5% of 6 lakh, but that's not what's the meaning, because someone already has pointed out, okay, looking at these slab rates, they already has said, Shirin has said, it's a progressive tax. Navrita, beta, it's a progressive tax, matlab, if you earn 6 lakh, beta, it doesn't mean you need to pay 5% of 6 lakhs. The first 4 lakh rupees of income is exempted. It is not considered as a taxable income. It's not considered as a taxable income. इसका मतलब है 6 lakhs rupees is your annual income, but your taxable income as per the slab rate is only 2 lakh. So ideally, you are supposed to pay 5% of your taxable income, that is 2 lakh rupees, because the first 4 lakhs is exempted. So when I say exempted, does mean it doesn't, it's not considered as your taxable income. No tax levied on it. That's it. But what the finance minister has said this year, okay, for people earning up to 12 lakhs, I'm going to provide a tax rebate. Tax rebate does mean your income is taxable, but that money is what I don't want to take it from you. Like kabhi kabhi Onam ka time pe, you might have seen many shop chatters, they do offer some rebates, concessions, offers. Am I right? The same thing is what finance minister is saying. In order to boost the domestic consumption. Now tell me better, Navanita, how come reducing tax rates or reducing income tax or giving a tax rebate on our personal income would boost domestic consumption? Anyone in the class? Anjana? You understood my question, right? And I think you clear with, okay, you're clear with the first
Purchasing.
question. How much tax one has to be, okay, one is liable to pay if they earn 6 lakh rupees, 5% of 2 lakhs, because first 4 lakhs is tax exempted. Wo to theek hai na? Yes. But I'm saying the finance minister, okay, isn't it? This year she's been so generous. And she said, for people earning up to 12 lakh rupees of income, my government is going to provide a tax rebate. Rebate does mean, though your income is taxable as per the current slab rates, but I don't like to collect it. Agar if it is being deducted by your employer and paid to the government, don't worry, at the end of the year, aapka paisa aapko de dungi. But my question to you, beta, is to all of you in the class is, how come reducing personal income tax would boost the domestic consumption? Very good. Okay, Shirin has already answered. Yeah, fantastic. Because it brings down or it increases the disposable income of people. And I hope you understand the meaning of disposable income, the income. Because if you are earning some 20 lakh or 30 lakh rupees of money, it doesn't mean that you have the privilege to spend all of your money. Not all the income that you are earning is at your disposal. Being a citizen of India, you are liable to pay some compulsory payments to the state in the name of taxes. Am I right? Agar if that tax component itself would come down, don't you really think you would be left with more money in your hands? And that too, when middle class people are left with more money, don't you really think? What do you think if you're left with more money, beta? If your disposable income increases, there are two things you could do. Right? It's as simple as that. Let me show you. Generally, if people make money, let's say if someone is earning some income, if someone earns some, let's suppose, income. So what do you really think people are going to do with that income? Yes. So whatever the income we earn, right, we either use it for a consumption, maybe on necessities, wants, luxuries. Am I right? Yes. And some of the money would be spent in the form of taxes. We are liable to pay some part of our income to the government in the form of taxes. And after meeting our consumption and taxation, if we are left with any amount of money, we end up saving that money. But now, don't you rethink if the government reduces our tax component, then we'll be left with more money to spend, or more money to save. More spending by people like you and me would result in more domestic demand, and more savings of people like you and me would result in more availability of capital. And more availability of capital, okay, would reduce the interest rates in the economy. Am I right? Do you all accept it, friends? Yes or no? When there is more amount of savings to the public, then obviously there is more money to lend. When there's more money to lend, lesser is interest rate. Lesser is interest rate, more would be the borrowings. More would be the borrowings, does mean more would be the investment. So that's how the government want to ensure the domestic economy would be boosted by mostly increasing domestic consumption and domestic investment. Because when it comes to GDP, it's not only government spending has to contribute more to GDP, the private spending could also result in contributing more to GDP, and investment, increase in investment would also result in contributing more to GDP. So that's the primary reason why the government. Yes, Shirin, obviously, beta. So the supply, when I say money, isn't it? So people now have more money to save. And when people save more money, obviously, what is going to happen? There is more availability of capital in the economy. When there's more availability of capital in the economy, obviously the interest rate comes down. That incentivizes people to invest, borrow, and invest. Yeah. Any doubt? So now someone is pointing out Shirin. Yes, of course, inflation. Yeah, very good. So Shirin says, okay, if disposable income of people increases, and her question is, don't you really think it's going to result in inflation? Of course, very good, beta. Okay, no doubt about it, and there's nothing wrong, definitely. But thing is that Shirin, I think you might be aware of the fact there is always a trade-off with respect to whatever the things we do in life. Life is all about trade-off. What do you mean by trade-off? Yes, if you want something, you need to forego something in return for it. So if Indian economy or the policymaker has made up their mind to boost the domestic economy, then definitely they should be ready to pay some price. And that price comes in the form of inflation. Now your next question, inflation increases, does interest rate increases? Of course. Very good, beta. In fact, that's the reason. In fact, tomorrow when I discuss about economic survey, I'm going to discuss about the reason why the Central Bank of India, the Reserve Bank of India, happened to keep the repo rate so high almost for the last 2 years. In fact, maybe you're all aware of the fact, May 2022, say, the RBI started increasing the repo rate. And since May 22, the RBI went on increasing interest rate, and only in the last policy review in February, the RBI has brought down the interest rate by 25 basis points. Why? Why did the RBI went on increasing interest rates? And you know, in the February, okay, in this month of, last month, February 6th, the RBI in its monetary policy review has brought down the repo rate by 25 basis points. And this is the first time RBI has reduced the interest rates in the last 5 years. It happened in COVID. In order to boost domestic demand, the RBI has brought down the repo rate to 4% during COVID. And then 22 say, from 2020 to 2022 May, the interest rate remained the same, 4%. But 22 May say the interest rate started increasing, and then only in the month of February, it has brought down to 6.25%. So I do accept it that okay, more disposable income would definitely result in more consumption. More consumption would result in boosting the prices. But beta Shirin, that is the price that we should be ready to pay if you really want to boost the domestic economic activity. Am I clear now? And even government also has an answer for it. Okay, it's not that just because government is saying so, I am supporting it. Because if you notice better, okay, which anyway I'm going to repeat it tomorrow as part of our economic survey. If you notice, the inflation in India, no doubt, is relatively high compared to the years before COVID. It's around 5 to 6% on average. But I guess you all know the fact. Do you know how many of you been aware of the fact? Difference between core inflation and headline inflation. What's the difference between core inflation, headline inflation, and food inflation? Yes. What is the difference between core inflation, headline inflation, and food inflation? Come on here. What do you mean by headline inflation? Or how is inflation calculated in India? Using wholesale price index, consumer price index, producer price index, service price index, GDP deflator. How is it calculated?
CPA.
CPA. Very good. So since 2015, okay, 16, 15, we had a monetary policy framework agreement. So more or less since 15, say, we have, I mean, RBI targets inflation computed based on CPA. So someone, okay, Shirin already pointed, when I say headline, very good beta. When it's a headline, does mean whatever the inflation that appears as part of headline in the newspapers, whatever the media reports in its headlines. Okay, there are different ways to compute inflation. One using GDP deflator, the other using wholesale price index, then the consumer price index. Within CPI, we have index for urban people, rural people, a combined consumer price index. But whatever the media reports as part of its headlines is what we call. As of now, the CPA combined is what RBI targets. I guess you all might be aware of the fact that RBI has been given an external mandate, an explicit mandate by government. What's the mandate? As per monetary policy framework agreement, the RBI should keep the inflation in India within the range of 4 plus or minus 2%. In case if RBI fails in containing inflation within the range of 4 plus or minus 2%, that's been minimum 2%, maximum 6%. In case if RBI fails in keeping inflation within control, that is within 2 to 6% for 3 consecutive quarters, the RBI has to give it in writing to the government, explaining the reasons for its failure. Why am I not able to? I guess you might be aware. I'm assuming, and if you have any doubt, please do interrupt me. I'm happy to clarify it. Am I clear? Say yes or no. Yeah. So I'm assuming that you're already aware of it. But in case if you have any problem, in case if you think I might have used a term that you are not aware, and feel free to interrupt me. Okay? Am I clear? Yes. So if you notice the inflation rate, okay, in India in the last 1 2 years is been on an average around 5%. Around 5 to 6%. Okay, so I'm just giving an average because you don't need to mug up the inflation rate. Okay, the inflation rate for every month. Okay, so what's Shirin question? Current inflation rate. Okay, but current inflation rate. Okay, as per last month, I think you know better, Shirin. Inflation is computed on a monthly basis with a lag of not more than a month in India. So if you ask me the current inflation rate, I have the information about January month of inflation of January month that is being reported by government in the month of February. Because in India, inflation is computed on a monthly basis. So for every month we compute inflation with a lag of not more than a month. Matlab, before the next month gets completed. If you notice, that's the reason. Na? So if you are regularly going through newspaper, you would come across somewhere in the second week. So, okay, isn't it 13th, 14th of the month, you have the government reporting inflation rates of the previous month. This is the practice in India. Both based on wholesale price index, consumer price index, inflation is computed and announced in second week of the next month. So if you look at the current, because okay, February inflation abhi tak not announced, but if you look at January inflation based on CPI is around 5.22%. Okay, now let me ask you, what do you mean by inflation for the month of January 5.22? Imagine I'm a layman and I don't understand any technicalities, no technical terms related to inflation. So just assume I'm a layman and you explain to me what is the meaning of the sentence that inflation in the month of Jan 2025 is 5.22 or sirf 5%. Come on. What does it mean by Shirin? What does it mean? Yes? Okay. So what do you mean by inflation in the month of January 5%? How do you explain this? Chalo, make it fast. Yeah. Okay. So इसका मतलब है compared to the prices in Jan 2024, the month of Jan 2025 has experienced a rise in price by around 5%. A basket of goods and services that the CPI tracks has gone up by 5%. But don't worry, I'll come back to that. But let's try to look at the inflation. I mean, see current budget related aspects. Is that okay? So now, if you look at, as I said, so don't worry, we're going to discuss about the inflation, the RBS monetary policy. Isn't it? This part I would explain tomorrow as part of our economic survey. But now let's come back to the actual discussion, the very actual purpose of discussion related to budget. So now I hope you have a pretty good understanding. So what are the prevailing conditions as of now, both within the economy and outside the economy? Isn't it? So that being the reason, the government of India or the finance minister this year had a primary focus to boost domestic economic activity rather than relying on the external sector. Because she knows the fact Trump anyway is gonna be in power for 4 years. And the European nation already started imposing high tariffs indirectly in the form of carbon border and blah blah. So it doesn't make sense until the global economy revives, because that too, as of now, there is a isn't it? In fact, a reverse globalization taking place. To be frank with you, there's the phenomenon of reverse globalization. There's been a large scale fragmentation of economy taking place. Right? Every nation is trying to protect its own domestic market by imposing high tariffs. So that that itself would convey the reason it doesn't make sense relying or formulating a strategy to boost the domestic economy by relying on the global demand. So that's the reason she has thought of incentivizing domestic consumption, domestic investment. Of course, this comes with a price. What's the price? That Shireen pointed out, inflation. But that is something, if you run faster, your heartbeat increases. But if you really want to catch the bus, you should run faster, or you should miss the bus. You would miss the bus. That's it. There's always a trade-off. Am I clear? The same thing happens. So when the finance minister or the government has made up its mind to prioritize growth, then they should keep it in mind. It comes with the necessary evil, that's inflation, and you should be ready to tackle it. Okay. So now coming back, if you notice it, okay, the reason why Indian economy was really able to perform relatively better, because I think you all might be aware of the fact India is the fastest growing economy in the last 1 decade. And the primary reason is, of course, the strongest, I mean, the greatest strength of Indian economy is domestic consumption. At the same time, if you look at, just let me show you this picture. So if you look at, my dear friends, okay, so can you see this slide? What I say? Trend in capital expenditure. What do you mean by it? What do you mean by trend in capital expenditure? What do you mean by it, beta? So if you look at the capital expenditure of India, capital expenditure, what do you mean by capital expenditure? Come on. Explain me in a simple sentence, simple word. What is the capital expenditure? What's the difference between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure? Amala? What is the difference between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure? Or what is the fundamental difference between revenue and capital? Because you might have come across the terms revenue receipts, revenue expenditure, capital receipts, capital expenditure. And I am asking a simple question: how would you differentiate a transaction as a recurring of a revenue and a capital transaction?
Revenue expenditure or expenditure that are formed by government for infrastructure developed in our domestic production.
Okay. Then what's the capital expenditure, Kristen?
Purchasing amenities, like nuclear reactor models, like.
Okay. So in fact, okay, so let me make things simple. Okay, let's not, okay, of course you have given me some examples, but for those people who might not be having a proper clarity, let me just give you a very simple way of differentiating capital two-way transaction, Shireen. Then revenue, don't you think revenue better is a two-way transaction? Because you might have come across revenue receipt, you might have come across revenue expenditure, right? Property formation. Okay, yeah, very good. So now let me simplify it. Revenue transaction does mean any transaction. Generally, the property of a revenue transaction, or what is called revenue, is something recurs, repeats with a certain frequency, a certain time period. Anything that keep repeats, recurring. And the non-recurring economic transactions is what we categorize as capital transactions. Okay, so let me show you this part. So if you look at, okay, here is basically the pie chart. Okay, so in this year, out of 1 rupee, I mean, you just simply look at how is the government going to mobilize a rupee. So if you look at corporation tax, I mean, tax on corporate profits around 17 paise, and the income tax that is around 22 paise. Okay, so use corporate direct tax, direct tax, income tax, direct tax, customs 4 paise, union excise duties 5 paise, and then you have GST 18 paise. If you look at all of these receipts, what do you think is common among all these receipts, whether direct or indirect tax? They are all recurring in nature. They repeat. Got it? So any such transaction that repeats with a certain time period is what we call recurring transaction, and they are classified as a revenue transactions. In this case, since it is inflow, इसी वजह से ना I've been using the term called revenue receipt. But there would also be recurring receipt to the government, not necessarily in the form of tax, and that is what you call non-tax receipt. देखा? Non-tax receipt. How much it is? 9 paise. So out of every 1 rupee that gets credited into Consolidated Fund of India, what contributes 17 paise? Corporation tax, 22 paise? Income tax, and then non-tax receipt. Can someone give me an example of a non-tax receipt? And I'm saying it is a revenue receipt. It is a recurring receipt, but not in the form of tax. Not in the form of tax. Can someone give me one example, sirf one example of a non-tax receipt? And I'm saying the clue is it's a recurring receipt. Yeah, interest. Matlab, what do you mean by beta, Shweta? Interest, matlab? Fines, penalty. Very good. Okay, yeah. Now you people are responding. Very good. Yeah, interest. When I say Shweta, okay, can you clarify beta? Interest, matlab? The interest government pays on the loans borrowed, or interest the states. Fatima, GST is a revenue receipt. Okay, I do accept it, but it's a tax receipt. But Fatima, beta, I'm asking you, give me an example of a recurring receipt, but not in the form of tax. Like some of your friend have Afinda has pointed out fines, penalties, fee, user charges. They are all recurring and non-tax receipts. And Shweta has pointed out something called interest, but I just want to clarify. I want more clarification, beta. Very good. Okay, yes. So interest payments made by the states on the loans borrowed from the center. Now, do you accept it, beta Shweta? It is a recurring receipt to government of India because the states who borrowed money, let's say your chief minister, Mr. Pinarayi Vijayan, has borrowed money from union government, and upon the loans he borrowed, he has to service the loan by paying interest. Am I right? Very good. That's it. Okay. Or let me ask you a simple question: dividends paid by central public sector undertakings. Dividend payments. Can I call it say non-tax revenue? Hi, Anna. Very good. That's it. So I hope now you got it. The difference between revenue and capital transaction. So revenue transactions are recurring in nature. It could be in the form of tax or it could be in the form of non-tax revenue. And now next comes, if you look at now look at the major chunk. Okay, borrowings and other liabilities. Out of every 1 rupee that gets into Consolidated Fund of India, 24 paise, almost 1/5, okay, 1/4. Isn't it? Nearly 1/4 of our receipts is in the form of borrowings and liabilities, other form of capital. And is it a revenue receipt or a capital receipt? Borrowings and other liabilities. Is it a revenue receipt or a capital receipt? Yes. Type R for revenue receipt and C for capital receipt. Come on, make it fast. Very good. Isn't it? It's a capital receipt because it doesn't recur, right? Of course, you might think, sir, every year we keep borrowing. Of course, but ideally it's not supposed. Right? In fact, to be more specific, revenue transactions mostly influence your income and expenditures. They alter the income and expenditures. Whereas capital transactions would influence or affect assets and liabilities. Assets and liabilities. That's the proper way of categorizing them. So if you look at borrowings and other liabilities, don't you think borrowings would result in a change in your liabilities? That's the reason why we happen to categorize the capital transaction. But any transaction that affects the income and expenditure of the government, then we classify as part of revenue expenditure or revenue transactions. And now next comes, so look at this, 1 paise out of rupee is received in the form of non-debt capital receipt. Can someone give me an example? It's a capital receipt, but not a non-debt creating. A receipt that doesn't result in any liability. One example, एक example. Take example. Beta Shweta, this is a question for you. You said the interest payment made by Mr. Pinarayi Vijayan to the union government is a revenue receipt. But now tell me, beta, your chief minister says, I don't need your loan. I'm going to pay the principal back. In such case, where would you want me to place in the budget of the government of India? Understood, beta? My question is, your chief minister has paid back whatever the loan he borrowed from the center. The loan repaid by the states to the center. So how do you want me to classify it? Revenue receipt, capital receipt. Is a debt creating receipt, non-debt creating receipt? Make it fast. Yes. Loans repaid by the state is a capital receipt, and moreover, it's a non-debt creating capital receipt. Am I right? Very good. Fantastic. Our example. Okay. Now let's say, beta Shweta. Okay. The proceeds from disinvestment. Government happens to sell some, let's say some 10% shares in BPCL or HPCL. The proceeds, the money the government makes through disinvestment. So how do you want me to classify it? As part of borrowings and other liabilities, non-debt capital receipts, non-tax receipts, GST, non-debt capital receipt. Now you got it right? Yes. And as such, I happen to begin the lecture saying the budget is an annual financial statement that consists of all possible receipts. And now you have noticed what are the major receipts and what contributes what percentage to the consolidated fund. Am I right? So now if you I think it's clear, right? Any doubt? Yes. Okay. And now let's also have a glance experience. So if you now come back, if you just come back, you notice the fact the government in the recent past, in fact, the primary reason why India was able to report such a consistent and a decent growth. Of course, in the last 2 years, the economic growth of India is slowing down. Last year we reported 8.2, but this year is going to be somewhere around 6.5 to 6.8, and the next year is also be going to be somewhere around 6.5 to 6. I mean, roughly around 6 to 6.5. But last year is around 8.2. So why is that the Indian economy has been slowed down? It is, of course, no doubt the external factors and at the same time internal factors. But though the economic growth is slowing down, but I guess you all know the fact, even though it's such a slow growth rate, India still remains the fastest growing economy. And you know the reason? Okay, one of the important reason is the deliberate spending of government in the name of creation of capital assets, infrastructure spending. If you look at last year budgetary allocations when it comes to infrastructure or capital expenditure is 11,11,101 crore. And this year it almost happens to be more than 12 lakh crore rupees. And do you believe the fact that when government spends more and more money, that would result in generation of more and more income? You accept it? Yes or no? Don't you really think every penny spent by government, who is going to receive it? Who is going to benefit out of it? Yes. Let's suppose the government has come with a plan to connect Tirunelveli and Cochin with an expressway, with an 8-lane expressway. Tirunelveli and Kochi, with an 8-lane expressway. Do you think the government itself is going to do the entire job? No, it just awards this contract to some construction company. Let's suppose the project costs 30,000 crore rupees of money. The government has made a plan to connect Kochi and Trivandrum with an 8-lane expressway. And the government figured it costs 30,000 crore rupees of money. So what does government do? It awards this contract to some road construction company. And once the company happens to get paid this money for the project, it got completed, what do you think the people are going to do with it? So what does the construction company does with this money? Yes. So do you think the company who happens to make this 30,000 crore rupees is going to keep it with itself? No. The 30,000 crore rupees of money, part of the money is what the company, the construction company, would spend on its labor, machinery, cement, steel. Am I right? So now all the labor or those over, okay, those people who happens to participate in the construction of road, they do all get paid some amount of money, right, Krishnan? Do you accept it? Now let's suppose, imagine, Krishnan, you yourself is an engineer who has been part of construction of this expressway. You earn some money. And what do you do with that money? You again spend that money, some part of it. Isn't it? Let's say, am I clear? So that's how a spending of government, I mean, spending of 30,000 crore rupees of government, that generate income, which is a multiple of it. Because 30,000 crore rupees of spending by government becomes an income to my construction company. Let's suppose, imagine I am the one who happened to be awarded the contract of constructing this expressway. So I receive 30,000 crores. Then I spend, let's suppose, 28,000 crores. 2,000 crores is my profit. Baki 28,000 crore rupees on the cost of construction. So 28,000 crore rupees is the money I spend it, and that becomes income to someone else. And those people who receive this 28,000 crore rupees of money, they again spend some part of it. So that's how spending of government of 30,000 crores would generate an income within the economy, which is a multiple of 30,000 crores. Do you all accept it? Hi, right? In fact, this is generally, in simple terms, is what we call crowding in effect. Crowding in. When I say crowding in, that's been increase in state spending, government spending would result in increase in private sector spending. Because if the government happens to allocate more and more amount of rupees, more and more amount of money for infrastructure, then there would be increase in demand for steel, increase in demand for cement, increase in demand for construction workers. You guys getting what I mean to say? So increase in public spending or increase in government spending would result in increase in private sector spending. Do you accept it? So that's how the government deliberately increasing its expenditure could stimulate the economic activity. When I say stimulating economic activity, does mean it's an intense and affirmative action by the government to boost economic activity. And that is what people also refer as a pump priming. Pump priming, a deliberate intention, a deliberate activity to boost economic activity. And how could government could achieve it? By simply increase the spend or reduce the tax rates. You reduce the tax rates, goods and services becomes costly, especially indirect taxes. That results in people consuming more. That's one way you could boost the economic activity, and one way you could boost the domestic consumption. The other way, let the government itself spend more money. And whenever government spend more money, that generates more income within the society, within the economy. And more income does mean more spending, isn't it? So that's what is very good. Expansionary fiscal policy. And this deliberate action is what we call a fiscal stimulus or pump priming. So what I'm saying, is Beta Shirin, is the reason why India was still able to report a decent economic growth, not only because of a very large domestic consumption capacity, but at the same time, the government of India consistently is allocating more and more money for infrastructure. So if you notice it, you could look at the trend. Here is a trend, in capital expenditures. If you look at, just look at, 16-17. Look at the year 16-17. That's been roughly around 7-8 years back. The total capital expenditure, look at the blue one, is hardly 2.8 lakh crore. But with that, it's around 11.2, five-fold increase in hardly a span of 6-7 years. So that means the government happens to phenomenally increase it's a capital expenditure on creation of capital assets. And that itself is resulting in generation of more income. And when there is a more income being generated, people obviously spend more money. And that's basically the reason, what's the primary driver behind Indian economic growth. But can someone point out any problem in boosting economic activity by deliberately government increasing its spending? Of course, here in this case, government is not spending money in the form of freebies, right? Again, if the government borrows money and simply throws back the money to the people in the name of some XYZ freebie by directly transferring cash to the accounts, then you think, Sarji, there is no productive activity. Because what's the government doing? Borrowing money, and that's what it is giving back to people by depositing that money, direct cash transfer into their accounts. Isn't it? In this case, there's hardly any reason productive economic activity is taking place. Am I clear? So in such case, you would say this is not the right way of spending money. But if you notice, the current government is spending money. And how is it spending money? How is it spending money? By simply spending a good part of its money on creation of capital assets. And that itself is the reason I've been saying, if you notice, okay, it's been clear on the, okay, isn't it, on the board, that the trend in capital expenditure, look at 16, 17, say, 25, 26. So somewhere around 2.8 lakh crores, say 11.2 lakh crores. It's literally a five-fold increase. But I'm saying, can someone point out any challenge or a problem in this strategy? What might be a problem in this strategy? Yes? Anyone, friends? Yeah, what might go bad? Okay, and here is a clue. Look at the last line. I explain what is crowding in. Explain what is crowding in. And here is a clue. Come on, make it fast. We have less time. Right? So how would you define the term crowding out? Okay, so let me not, okay, take your time. Okay, so let me simplify it. So like I've been saying, so the one of the primary reasons behind, okay, Indian economic growth or a fast growth in India is the increase in spending by government, that too on capital assets. And that too, when the government is spending more and more on infrastructure, of course, India would have a good quality of infrastructure, and a good infrastructure is very much, in fact, it is the need of the hour for a country like India to achieve or to realize the dream of Viksit Bharat and boost the economic activity. No doubt about it. But the problem is, if you want to spend more money, then you need to borrow more money, or you need to tax your people more. And हमारे देश में people already end up complaining that we Indians, that too especially middle class, is being heavily taxed. Our income is taxed, our expenses are being taxed, and your investments, if they earn money, that is being taxed. Yes or no? Let's say you go end up, okay, invest some money on stock markets. So when you buy a share, you're liable to pay security transaction tax, and then more or stamp duty, then the GST, and then the broker takes some fee. And when you sell it, again you're liable to pay security transaction tax, GST. And in case you buy a share at 100 rupees and sell it at 110 rupees, you're liable to pay capital gains tax. So the the typical Indian middle class or majority of Indians do already concerned with a very high tax burden. But if the government still want to raise more money for a reasonable spending, don't you really think there's a limited scope for government? It cannot tax its people more. Then the only alternative has to borrow more. But is there any problem in borrowing more money and spending on a productive assets like infrastructure? Nothing wrong. Because this infrastructure would help India report a decent growth, because the next generation would be happy, right? And they would be happy to repay back the loans because the government has made a reasonable investment. But इसमें problem क्या है? If the government do borrows a large sums of money from the economy, the availability of capital or the demand for loans or the demand for capital increases, which results in a crowding out effect. Crowding out effect does mean large borrowings of government would result in less availability of capital to lend. Because someone like government would simply come to the market and say, "Arey bhai, dekho, this year I would like to borrow 17 lakh crore rupees of money." Say, okay, isn't it? 17 lakh crore rupees of money is what government itself borrows. And you know the fact, and I know the fact, that there is always a limited supply of money to lend in the economy, right? So when the money to lend is limited and government itself has an ambitious plan to borrow a large chunk of it, don't you really think it would really make it difficult for a private sector or a corporate like you and me to raise this money or to borrow money and further expand our business? Am I clear now? And that's what, again, there is a trade-off. Large borrowings of government, and government no doubt is making a decent spending, but at the same time it is resulting in crowding out the capital markets. So the private sector is worried, and they say, Dekho, we need capital for our business, either to expand our business or to run our business, the working capital or the fixed capital. But no matter whatever is the capital required, it's costing us too much, isn't it? So I think most of you might be aware of the fact the role and the importance of capital. Am I right? So I guess you are already aware of the fact that India is the only country that has reached South Pole of Moon. And we are the country that has been successful in the first mission of what comes to Mars. We're the first, we're the country who happens to launch our rover on Mars in the first attempt. Of course, the reason why I'm just giving you this example is when it comes to scientific advancement, that in space, we already proved. So if India has such a great scientific capability, technological capability, why is it in many parts of India you could still find the markets being flooded with Chinese goods? When I say Chinese goods, not any complex gadget like a mobile phone. In fact, mobile phone TK chalta. But even you find a cigarette lighter. Even a cigarette lighter. Name any, okay, just look at any part of India, you just go figure out cigarette lighter. Why cigarette lighter? Okay, in fact, even during Onam, you might have seen most of the goods that we buy. Ganesh Chaturthi, even the idols are also made from China. Diwali, you could see the firecrackers are imported from China. Does that mean, Mr. Krishnan, that India cannot afford to produce it? Can't we make our own Ganesh idol? Can't we make our own firecrackers? In fact, since before we all born, Shokashi is known for it. Am I right? And can't we manufacture cigarette light? Then why is the Indian market flooded with these Chinese goods? Can someone point out? Yes. What do you really think could be the challenges? Like I've been saying, make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat. So the idea of make in India is to go for import substitution, reduce our dependency on imports and replace it through domestic production. Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliance. We are very proud for it. We are very proud of it. And there's nothing wrong trying to be self-reliant. It is impossible to become self-sufficient, but there is nothing wrong in trying to become self-reliant. Atmanirbharta is very much necessary. But the question is, if Indians were capable enough to launch rover on the Mars in the first attempt, and the only people on Earth to reach the South Pole of Moon, can't we make a cigarette lighter? Yeah. So what Shireen says is that there's a more demand in India. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, beta. If there is a more demand within India, if India has such a great consumption capacity, my question is why to import from China? Why not we meet the consumption or why not we meet the demand in India through domestic production? That's my question. Why not Indians make the cigarette lighters? Why not Indians meet the demand by simply producing more firecrackers? Am I clear? So you cannot say, sir, China may, they would also, okay, isn't it? Right? Lack of infrastructure, Shirin, okay. So in case she means to point out, India doesn't have proper infrastructure. Okay, what else? Of course, I do accept it. Our infrastructure, especially compared to not only China for that, but any East Asian country, like Thailand for that matter. Okay, you name Vietnam, Philippines. So if you look at any East Asia country, they do have a better infrastructure, physical infrastructure, isn't it? And our infrastructure in any metropolitan cities are no match to their infrastructure. Okay, but what else? इसके अलावा what else is the problem? I have already discussed it. Cost of production is very high. Why, Shweta, beta? Why, Shweta? Why do you think the cost of production in India is very high? Absolutely right. And one of the reasons why the cost of production is very high, it's because of bad infrastructure. Obi TK. And can you elaborate it more? Why is the cost of production is high? Labor intensive techniques, very good. Okay, so we mostly rely on labor intensive techniques, outdated technology. Okay, lack of enough raw materials, very good. Auto BTK, very good, isn't it? So, in fact, beyond all these things, of course, there have been n number of reasons. But and the another most important reason happens to be lack of cheaper capital. So India doesn't have a fair and competitive capital markets. So the average cost of capital in India is much higher than compared to our competitors. Now imagine if Anjana Suresh herself is an investor or a businessman. If she has to end up paying 20% of the capital she borrows, whereas her competitor in China could avail the same capital at 2%, don't you really think that he could produce the same good at a much cheaper price, because he ends up paying only 2% interest rate, but the poor guy, okay, the poor lady Anjana end up paying 20%. Of course, it's not so high, but I am saying one of the other major challenge is the capital cost in India is very high. And I hope now you understood the trade-off. So there is nothing wrong in government borrowing and spending on infrastructure. Infrastructure is the need of the hour. But at the same time, too much borrowing results in crowding out the markets. And the crowding out of markets results in increased interest rates, and that discourages private investments. They tell me, beta Anjana, by that logic, can we stop or can we discourage government to invest more on public infrastructure? No, because that's necessary. If India really want to realize the dream of Vikshit Bharat, to become the developed country and to quadruple its GDP, we need world-class infrastructure, right? We are still in the process of electrifying Indian railways. And the length of railway line hardly happens to change in the last 20-30 years. Of course, recently the government is spending good amount of money, but you will be noticing. Just once the lecture is completed, do spend 2 minutes on finding out what's the railway length of India when Britishers left India, and what's the length of railway line in India after 75 years. You'll be surprised. And look at what China has added. So we need good amount of allocation for infrastructure, but that comes with a cost. What's the cost? Increase in demand for capital, which increase interest rates, and that further might reduce the private investment. But then how would you increase the availability of capital? That's where you have an answer. The reason why the finance minister has thought of reducing tax rates, because it increases disposable income. So thereby it increases not only consumption, it also increases savings, more availability of capital. And that too, the government want to ensure it's not only government has to take the primary role of boosting economy. Now the government says it is high time the consumption expenditure households and the private investment expenditure should also help driving Indian economic growth. Because, my dear friends, you know, India requires minimum 8% consistent growth. I'm saying minimum, not maximum. Minimum 8% consistent growth to realize the dream of Vikshit Bharat. And do you think this burden could be shouldered only on Mr. Modi, Union government? No, it's not practical. The states should contribute. The private sector should contribute. The household should contribute. In what way? By adding more capitalists, by spending more, by creating more demand. And that would result in a virtuous cycle. And that's basically the very basic theme of the entire budget. And if this is how we keep on formulating our plans and try to boost our domestic activity, then definitely India has a great potential to realize or to achieve a growth rate of 8%. It's not that India has never reported growth rate of 8%. Of course, we never crossed more than 10%, but 8% is not a tough challenge. But Indian government has made up its mind. It is something that cannot be achieved only by the Union government, by government spending. That's the reason, if you notice, the entire theme of budget is mostly on boosting private spending. So that's what it is. So now let's look at the basic theme of the budget. So if you look at this, is basically the budget continues the government's effort to one, accelerate growth and secure inclusive development and invigorate private sector investments, uplift household sentiments, and hence spending power of India's rising middle class. In fact, whatever I've discussed is what is being written on this board. That's it. You understood now the theme of the budget? Am I clear? Yes. So having understood these things, now let me just give you some before going ahead. Okay. Basically, what? Yeah. So in order to achieve this dream, this goal, so the government has, I think in the last budget itself, the government has, Madam Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman happens to refer to four different castes, right? What are those four different castes? Okay, it's not basically, isn't it? So she is referring to four different castes. That is Garib, Youth, Annadata, and Nari Shakti. And these are the terms she used in the last year budget. And that's what she's saying. Okay, in order to realize the dream of India becoming a Vikshit Bharat, a developed country, India has to primarily focus on these four different categories. Poor, uplift the poor people, eradicate poverty, okay, impart better skills. Because as we already know the fact, agriculture sector, one of the major challenges for Indian economy as of now, there's a over dependence of population in agriculture. Someone pointed out disguised unemployment, and disguised unemployment highly prevalent within the agriculture sector. Rather than other than disguised unemployment, the other major challenge when it comes to agriculture sector, the employment opportunities are seasonal. And if you have noticed it, the contribution of agriculture sector to GDP hardly, in fact, that's remained hardly around 18%. So 45% of Indians hardly do contribute 18 rupees out of 100 rupees of GDP. So that being the reason, the per capita income of these people who are heavily dependent on agriculture is extremely low. And that explains the reason why poverty is largely concentrated in rural India. And since there is not enough employment opportunities, the average income of the people earning within rural India is pretty low. That itself is resulting in a problem within urban India. Case lack of opportunities is pushing the labor to the urban India, resulting in a push migration. But the problem is the city is not ready to accommodate these people. Am I right? So that explains the reason why good part of, I mean, in every Indian city, name any Indian city. So can someone in the class point out a city without slums and squatter settlements? Any city, friends? No way. Why? Why these cities in India is experiencing this unsustainable growth? The proliferation of slums, squatter settlements. Why? Because the city is not ready to absorb the increasing labor force that's simply flooding to the city. Because the city is not experiencing a sustainable growth. The migration when it comes to rural to urban in India is not a pull migration. It's not a city pulling. It is basically the villagers are pushing them. And why is it so? Village or the rural economy is not okay having enough employment opportunities. The over dependence. And that explains the reason why the average and the per capita income of people living on agriculture sector is pretty low. Right? You all know the fact India is the fifth largest economy. Yes, no doubt. But do you know the fact, according to National Crime Record Bureau, one farmer commits suicide for every 45 minutes. And 10 years back, it's much okay. 10 years later back, it's much worse. One farmer used to commit suicide for every half an hour. And what's the reason behind it? So no matter the reason behind it, we don't have time to discuss about all of this, but at least you understand the fact. Okay, there is something seriously that India has to, or Indian state has to do to address this challenge primarily in the agriculture sector. So now, beta, if someone asks you a question, what would be the sustainable solution to increase the per capita income of farmers or to increase the per capita income of people dependent on agriculture sector? I want a sustainable solution, something that makes sense, sustainable. Don't end up simply saying, sir, let's print money and deposit 1 crore into every person's bank account, especially farmers, and every farmer will become a crorepati. I want a sustainable solution. Because even the current Modi government also promised, our government happens to have the target of doubling the income of farmers. To what extent it has been realized, let's not debate about it. But still, if you've been asked, give me a sustainable solution to increase the income of farmers. So Gopika says MSP. So she says, I would promise the farmers that they get a decent price for their output. But I would say, Gopika, isme problem hai beta. It's not sustainable. Why? Because for how long time you keep on just simply paying more and more MSP and you end up increasing MSP, then obviously it results in food inflation. Because when you increase MSP, and at the same time, better, okay, around 1 hour back, I was referring, India ka problem kya hai? We have a skewed cropping pattern. So some crops are cultivated on a large scale, and we at the end of the day we are neglecting cultivation of some other crops. You see, you have too much paddy. We have enough paddy to feed the world, but you don't have enough oil seeds to feed the Indians, right? And one of the primary reasons is because of this MSP. It resulted in a skewed cropping pattern, and it's not a good idea. It's not a sustainable solution. No way. And she didn't just market access. So she says, I would connect farmers to the markets and provide better market access. Okay, I would accept it. That's one. Iske alawa, come on, make it fast. The ideal and solution is reduce the dependence on agriculture. Because if you notice, my friends, at the time India attained independence, 90% of Indians are dependent on agriculture. Am I right? 90%. But if you look at the percentage of population dependent on agriculture has reduced. But you're missing the point. The absolute number of people dependent on agriculture is increasing. Because those days 90% of 40 crore are dependent on agriculture. But abhi to 50% of 140 crore are dependent on agriculture. Am I right? So the long run solution, we should reduce the dependence. Right? So rather than 50% of Indians depend on agriculture, just imagine only 20% of Indians are the one who is cultivating this 145 million hectares of land, then definitely the per capita income of farmers has a reason to increase. But then the challenge is, if you, okay, so you, it's a simple solution. Okay, when it comes to solution, it's simple, but it's difficult to implement. Okay, see, if you reduce the dependency, and to reduce the dependency, there has to be an alternate source of employment. And can you employ all of these people in Microsoft, Google? Do they have better skills where they could really be employable in this sector? No. Service sector has a very low employment elasticity. Then the only option we're left with is manufacturing, the untapped sector in India. Because manufacturing, if you go back and look at 1990, okay, 1990s contribution of industrial sector to GDP, now you notice the fact it's stagnated. Now India has a great scope. But the challenge still remains: bad infrastructure, lack of proper availability of capital, stringent labor laws, land acquisition, forget about it. It is near impossible to acquire in India after 2013 Land Acquisition Act. Isn't it? So until unless you have better deregulation, liberalize further, you should, okay, generally what do an investor expects? Liberal labor laws, liberal land acquisition laws, and liberal capital and competitive fair capital markets. And then comes the good infrastructure and better supply of human capital. These are things necessary. And that's where the state has to focus on. Got it? And we're going to continue the discussion tomorrow. Okay. So, and I expect, okay, you to interact and participate in the discussion. Don't worry. Okay. So if it required, I would simply extend my discussion. But at the end of the day, I want you to gain something in our interaction. Okay. So I don't want it to be like a monologue from the next session. So do come back. Okay. Just revise whatever has been taught by your economy teacher in your classes, and that helps in a better interaction. Am I clear, sir? Am I clear, friends? Okay. So today I will be, okay, so we'll take a break for today and we'll resume the session tomorrow, sharp 10. Okay. So that's for the day. Bye.